Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a five-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. The soul of business. Soul. What is a soul? Well, a soul, according to the Greeks, it's that spirit that underlies everything, that gives life to everything that we experience on this planet, and literally, I think, in the universe. There's nothing that exists, again, from my experience and from my perspective, that does not have a soul in some way, shape, or form. And why is that important? Well, because the soul is casting us in a unique way. Every one of us, every entity that we encounter is a unique expression of what could be considered a unifying force. It's a differentiated experience. It's a differentiated expression. And in business, that differentiation becomes, from my perspective, your secret sauce, your secret power, whatever it might be, because nobody can replicate it. And if you can land on that, you got some leverage that others wouldn't have necessarily in the same way. So why do I mention all of that? Well, my guest today is Cari Jacobs-Crovetto, and she has been on a fascinating journey. And just before we started the recording here, I mentioned to her when the invitation to have her on the show came across my desk. I looked at the biography and everything that was attached to it, and I went, "Are you kidding me? Of course she's going to be on the show. She can't not be. She just brings so much." And I'm just going to riff a little bit here. I mean, we get 6 months in the Himalayas, meditating. Been to Burning Man 17 times. I mean, this is kind of just almost avocationally, but from a professional standpoint, 5 startups. One of them was sold to Walmart. I mean, she's got a pedigree that is significant and profound. Coaching Stanford University. She's published in Forbes. She's a Forbes Council member. So the spectrum that she occupies is pretty broad. And I would hazard to say also pretty deep. So I think we're going to have a fascinating conversation. Cari, welcome to the show.
Oh my gosh, Blaine, that introduction was the best I've ever heard. And I feel just emotion just hearing you reflect that back to me. Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you. I always say like recognizes like. And so you can't really know all that you pulled out of my bio unless you've been there yourself in some ways. So thank you for that beautiful intro.
Well, I haven't spent 6 months in the Himalayas, but I did spend time in a monastery in Japan.
Only four. I only did four.
Only
4 months, but that
Oh,
was a lot. I did 4 months, yes.
okay. Well, I want to just, have basically a wide-ranging conversation. I mentioned the spectrum that you occupy. I think that there's a lot that we can draw from here. I'm going to just start with a question that I ask just about every guest. When you hear the term, the soul of business, what does that bring up for you?
Well, I loved your entry here, how you expressed it at the beginning of the podcast, which is sort of this sort of unseen, in some ways, we use words to try to speak around the unseen or to speak around the things that we know connect us to something, but that we can't always put into plain English, right? And so for me, that soul piece has a couple dimensions. The first dimension is it is sort of like, what is the business itself when you hear or do business with it or touch or feel or come across it in an ad? What is this unspoken je ne sais quoi that comes up for people that they can't really put a finger on, but everybody can kind of agree on?
Mhm.
That in some ways is the unexpressed soul. The marketer in me would say that unexpressed soul, like my job as a CMO, would be to take that unexpressed and listen very intuitively to try to express it in some way, whether that's in words or colors. And then there's the click down, which is who are the people inside of that organization that are connecting into that soul with our own souls.
So there's a reciprocity that starts to come into play here. And my word for that reciprocity has to do with resonance. There's a vibrational frequency that kind of gets met and matched. And now we're kind of working some very interesting dynamics at that point. You used a word that I think is interesting, and it was listen. To listen for something. And I've spent a lot of years. I've done work with Fernando Flores, doing some ontological list. I mean, just all kinds of things. And the always listening. And I love that phrase. Fernando coined that. The always listening. There's something that's always churning in my head here. If I can get it quiet, there's something else that can emerge. And it has application, I think, with branding, but it also has application to just kind of how we as human beings transit this thing that we call life.
I love this. I love that you pulled this out. It reminds me of many, many, many years ago when I started meditating. I'm an avid meditator. When I was in the Himalayas, I was silent most of a good 3 months of about 4. And I had been going back and forth to, from the business world, right, where I was, putting on my CMO hat and running teams and looking at data and coming up with reports, into these highly sacred settings, right, where I was just sitting in silence, listening to myself, to my soul, to the universe, if you want to call it that, right? And so I was toggling back and forth. And one day I went to a Dharma talk from, one of the sage teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about how, marketing and advertising was just evil, right? And here I am, this like very, very avid, excited, deeply eager, dedicated student. And I hear, this teacher saying back to me that what I did for my work, my right work, was evil, inherently evil. And as you can imagine, it caused kind of an internal stir for me. Like, okay, do I need to I really loved my job. Do I need to throw it out the window, or like what's happening here? And, to forsake what I love doing for my career, in service to my spiritual practices. And the answer that I came to, albeit many years later, was that intuitive listening is always what I was good at. It's where I started in life. When I was born, I had vision problems. I couldn't see until I was 6. And so my listening, and I would say there were 2 sides of listening. There's like listening with your ears, right, to actually hear and then take in information and convert that information into meaning. But there's also intuitive listening, which is how do you listen with that 6th sense? And that piece of me was the piece that I was using in both of those contexts, right? So while I was being a CMO and when I was in sacred practice. And to me, that intuitive listening, that piece is what is kind of like the glide path to how you can meet soul.
Yeah. Well, I love that. Yeah, as a pilot, that notion of a glide path comes in quite nicely. Yeah, I'm on the glide path, and there's the runway. Yeah,
and there's the runway.
And
guess what? The runway was there all the time, right? It's like,
exactly.
And that's the thing with business too, right? This piece called the soul is sort of there all the time. And you also said something so beautiful where the people, like there's an alchemy, right? Where the people sort of meet the business itself and there's this exchange that's happening. And that even, that goes all the way through to hiring, right? How are you listening carefully to see what people you're bringing in without bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that we can keep diverse, equitable systems running, but without bias, but also with there's a heavy hand to knowing that every person that shows up to that door with their own soul is going to perhaps alter the companies.
Yeah. See, now that's, I've spent 40 years working with companies. I remember a conversation I had at Starbucks years ago. I spent about 5 years working with their executive group. And I was actually interviewing a store manager, and she had an open barista position. And I said, "Yeah, what's the problem?" Because she was actually somewhat frustrated. I said, "Yeah, obviously you've got applicants." She says, "Application isn't a problem. I've got about 70 applicants for this position." Well, then what's the issue? I can't find the right person. I can train them to pour coffee, to do a pull, for an espresso shot, but I need the right person here. And she was talking literally about and she was listening for that match to her store's culture, which ideally would be the store's culture would match the culture of the organization itself. And I was always struck by that. We hire people for what they can do, and then we fire them for who they are. And it's that
Mm.
who we are piece that I don't think gets tuned to very, very often or very well. Um, with your companies, like I said, you founded a couple of them, and had some successful exits. Uh, you wouldn't have done that without the right people in the right place. To steal a bit from Jim Collins here.
Yeah.
What did you pay attention to when you were hiring?
Well, I would say, and these companies were always had a CEO that had a great idea, right? I was coming in as a marketer to listen for what was the resonance of that great idea. And so it always started with the CEO. When you're building sort of 0 to 1
Mm-hmm.
companies and you're that small, it changes over time. When you've got a company that's enterprise, that's much different than when you're working 0 to 1. And I worked on, different businesses that were enterprise wide as well. But 0 to 1, I'm listening for what is it that the CEO really, really, really wants, right? Because you can say, oh, it's about a piece of software, right? Or it's about, here's the problem I'm solving, which is great, right? If you're
Mm-hmm.
solving a problem, that's a real problem. But I think I'm always listening more deeply because there's always some kind of hero's journey typically happening with a person, right?
Yeah.
Who's got the kahunas to start a company. And what is their hero's journey? What is it they really want? Right. And this brings us to sort of, a second topic that we can maybe talk about in part 2 of this, but oftentimes we start on one hero's journey and then we kind of get off track. And so part of my job was always to, especially in hiring people, is how do you lay down a vision statement, lay down a mission statement, lay down values that should CEOs change. Should you grow so fast that the CEO doesn't have the same level of impact or, direct intimacy with the staff that he or she used to have? How does the vision and the mission and the values serve as that tent pole or that organizing principle that keeps the soul intact of the
Yeah.
company? Right. So really the trick is I'm listening so carefully again. Right. It's not just listening to what they say, it's listening to that unsaid
Yep.
piece.
That
And I
unspoken.
think that's what makes magical CEOs, that what CMOs, leaders, people, right? Is how good are you at moving past just the obvious?
I know you're very familiar with Apple, and we won't get into why you're familiar with Apple. Um, but that being said, I know that Steve Jobs, and I've done a lot of work with folks that knew him really well. He absolutely was adamant about eschewing focus groups. He said, people don't know what they want typically. So he was listening for something different. And I'm just kind of struck by what you're speaking to here. He listened in a way that a lot of CEOs didn't listen. And it wasn't listening for where's the problem. It's listening for what's wanting to emerge. And then how can I align who we are with what wants to emerge? And as a consequence of that, the company begins to emerge in a different way as well. Is
That
that a
is so
fairly accurate
beautifully
assessment?
said.
Okay.
That's absolutely accurate. And it's very difficult as a CMO when you're coming in and you're saying, okay, I need $100,000 to go do research. And oftentimes, marketing is the first or second largest line item on a budget. And it's being like hyper examined by everybody in the executive team. And so I wouldn't disagree that research doesn't always need to be funded, because I think that most people don't know how to listen, to your point, to research. And to Steve's point, I'm guessing, I didn't know Steve, but I'm guessing that what he thought was, if you go to places where people are sort of going through their lives and doing what's expected, and then you put something in front of them, you're going to get expected.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve knew that there were people on the planet who were always looking for that unseen, that unsaid, that, to quote an overquoted Wayne Gretzky, like, skate where the puck is going,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well,
right. But even that, there's different ways to do that, right? You can almost data yourself to death and try to figure it out, or you can just listen, right? And
that's true. Just listening. And people that listen to this show have heard me say this a bunch of times. But the purpose of business, from my perspective, is to enhance the likelihood of thriving on the planet for anybody that comes into contact with your product or service. And
I love that.
I can't do that well unless I'm listening. I truly don't think that I'm able to do that well. I listen for what will light you up. And that's where the soul comes back into play here. And if what I'm offering doesn't light you up, that's wonderful. Somebody else will light you up. But there's enough people on this planet, about 8 billion of them, that I'm going to light up a couple of them if I'm consistent with who I am and who we are and what we're offering. And we do it with honor, and we do it with grace, and we do it with humility. We've got a pretty good basis to dance from.
Yes, absolutely. And if we do it with listening, right? And and inside of listening, by the way, is empathy.
Yep. Well, that's where the compassionate capitalism meme comes from when I wrote that book, A Journey to the Soul of Business.
Life-changing book for me. Well, thank you. Yeah, life-changing book for me.
We're going to take a real quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about force majeure. And, there's, a couple of ways that we can look at that. One is, this act of God that just turned everything upside down. But you've leveraged this in a very interesting way, and I want to talk about that when we come back.
Sounds good.
Okay. Folks, we'll be right back. Talking to Cari Jacobs-Crovetto and force majeure, and she is a force of nature. So we'll be right back in just a moment. The nature of life is evidenced in nature. Nature grows, and all of nature honors the desire to be more, to have more, and to do more. Life thrives when it's allowed to grow. And ideally, thriving is what we also, all of us, want to be able to do. Unfortunately, at some stage in life, most people find themselves settling into what I can only call a rut. And a rut is nothing more than a coffin with the ends kicked out. You want to quickly get out of any rut that you find yourself in. When you stop growing, that's when the coffin starts to appear. The simple truth is this, and this is true for everything in nature. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Every one of us dies. So the question we need to come to grips with is not, are we going to die? The question nature asks us to answer is, are we truly living? That's what motivation is about. It's the desire to move. It's the desire to grow and to excel. Have I lived? How have I lived? I'd love for you to take advantage of my Leadership Mindset Masterclass. It's all about providing you with the tools to ensure thriving for yourself and for those around you. Register today to receive the free introduction video and find out more about this acclaimed program. You'll also receive a copy of my international #1 bestseller, Compassionate Capitalism, A Journey to the Soul of Business. I'm Blaine Bartlett, and I look forward to helping you thrive. Folks, welcome back. Cari, before we left, I mentioned something about force majeure and these acts of God's. And my wife runs a foundation. She founded the foundation, the Unstoppable Foundation. We do work primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. I've been on the board for years. We've got about 500,000 people that are impacted daily by the work that we're doing. She's managed to raise round numbers about $38 million in the last decade or so.
Wow.
And it's all been gone. It goes directly to work. Now, where force majeure comes in, part of the fundraising, we would do a big gala every year at the Beverly Hilton. It was a star-studded event. We'd have all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was literally Jack Canfield called it the Oscars of the personal development marketplace, and it was just a fascinating place to work. And that usually happened in March. That was a springtime gala. Well, March of 2020, things went a little sideways, and we had contracts with hotels. We had contracts with all kinds of people that put a significant amount of cash on the line. And there was a clause in the contracts that is called force majeure. And that allowed us to pivot in a very interesting way. And what was interesting about it is that year we actually did quite well from a fundraising perspective, even though we didn't have the money coming in from our annual fundraiser. And it's that ability to just with grace, and I really take my hat off to Cynthia for this. With grace, she and her team pivoted. They didn't lose this sense of equanimity, although that doesn't mean stress wasn't there. But nobody's hair was on fire. It was kind of like, Michael Beckwith says something to the effect of, it is what it is, harvest the good, forgive all the rest. So it was what it was. Let's harvest the good out of this and move on. And this notion of force majeure as being something other than a calamity, that it can actually be a springboard. You had a crisis,
Yes.
so to speak. And again, I mean, you'd mentioned before the break here about these changes that occur, that all of a sudden that soul path, it's okay. I thought I was going to LaGuardia, and now looks like I'm going to Kennedy.
often that case,
Yeah,
right?
but the runway is still in some
or,
way, shape, or
or
form.
God forbid I need to fly through Chicago.
Oh, good Lord, no! Don't make it happen.
Right?
But you actually pivoted in 20. Yeah, it was about the same time, and
Yeah,
left your traditional job, which is what most people sign up for early on in their lives. There's a traditional way of living, and this is what I'm supposed to do because the world tells me this is what I'm supposed to do. But there's an awakening that occurs if you're paying attention that says, I can't do this
exactly.
anymore. I can't do this anymore. What happened for you, and what's been the consequence? Because you call your firm, you've got a consultancy now that's called Force Majeure. And when I first saw that, I'm like,
Yes.
what a cool name.
Because you get it. I think I've had more than one person who may or may not be connected with lawyers say, I don't get it. So you're saying that your company creates disasters? Well, no, I'm saying that I believe that most human beings will find the greatest opportunity for growth and learning in what are perceived disasters in their lives. I know that I have, when things are going great, which is great, you can coast along and flow along in life and pay attention to the sun and the squirrels and people's smiles, and I love that. However, there's something that occurs neurobiologically in us when we come up against our mostly averted circumstances, things that we are trying to avoid.
Yeah.
Right? Death, job loss, even the moment that I shared earlier where I was in the meditation hall and someone, one of the great teachers said, this job that you're in, it's evil. Right. And I had a choice in that moment. I could just buckle under that type of disaster and say, oh my goodness, I better listen and I better quit my job immediately and go, sign up for a monastery. Or I could look for, well, hold on a minute, something in my system, there's something that's about to be born here.
Yeah.
This is where the birthing canal lives, I believe. The birthing canal lives in these moments when we're faced with some really hard dilemma or really hard circumstance. And we have a choice. We can either collapse into that,
Hmm.
or we can like tear through that birth canal like a bat out of hell trying to figure out what life can teach us. And it's the same thing that Steve was saying. Really, if you go back to our earlier conversation, right? Are you listening for the obvious, or are you listening for something that's going to crack you wide open?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I personally have just found that the juice of life is in those wide open cracks. So what happened for me in 2020, I'd been going along in my career, and I had sort of what I called, the second bridge, right? I have sort of I have this like great career that was happening in marketing. And, if you were to look at me on paper, you would, think, wow, by 2019, Forbes had named me top 50 CMOs in the world for innovation. Like everything looked like it was just chugging along. 2020 hits. I had just taken a new CMO role job for a Y Combinator startup that was very, very young. It was the smallest startup I had ever joined. We needed to get Series B funding within 2 months
Oh,
in order to survive. I was quite confident that I could help them get there. And then bam, the pandemic hits. And we needed 2 years of runway. And I knew that without marketing money, I wasn't going to be able to do much. And so I went to my boss and I said, you know what? You need to lay me off. Like, it's not going to make sense to keep me. And I had no idea what I was going to do.
yeah.
We'd just gone on lockdown. Um, I was a single woman trying to stay alive in the Bay Area, which is like a triple duty task from anywhere else you will want to live. And I thought, I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I can't remember if it was that same conversation or maybe it was a few days later. That same CEO called me back up, CEO of Torch, Cameron Yarborough. I'll give him a shout out. He's an amazing friend and person and man. And he called me up and he said, you know what? Have you ever wanted to coach? And he said, you've been a great coach to me as the CEO, and you've been a great coach to others. And I think you would be fantastic if you thought about it. And the truth is, I hadn't really, but I definitely thought about like, what could I do with the wisdom I've gained? At that time, I was 52 years old, right? And I thought 53. And I thought, what could I do with this wisdom I've gained? And I just said, sure. And like within 1 or 2 days, I had registered for UC Berkeley has a coaching program.
Isn't
I
that great?
registered for that coaching program. Within 6 months, I was full. I had a full book of business, and the force majeure was born out of that moment in time where, the world just gave me a really hard problem. Certainly the other option would have been to sort of collapse and say, oh my God, it's COVID and we're all so afraid. And what am I going to do? And, who knows where the economy is going? And I just said, I'm going to run in this direction and see what happens.
Yeah. I co-hosted a show every week called The Office Hours with one of my business partners, David Meltzer. And we had a guest on today. And I was reminded of something that an old dear mentor of mine, a good friend, he's gone now, a fellow by the name of Jerry Jampolsky. Um, Jerry wrote, actually, if you've ever read The Course in Miracles,
Oh, yes.
Jerry was instrumental in writing that and actually bringing it to market. He was an amazing human being. He wrote a small little book that was called Love is Letting Go of Fear. And I remember reading that book in the 1970s, late 1970s, when I was just beginning my journey in the personal development arena. And it's stayed with me ever since. And I had the very good fortune of getting to know Jerry pretty well before his passing, well before his passing. But where I'm going with this is the soul resonates around love, and I don't mean that from any kind of oh my God, I want to marry you and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
this notion of What would I love? And it's the I, and where this goes to is who's the I that is answering the question? Because yeah, part of what you work with, and I really like the way that you set this up on your website. To live in a world of enlightening humanity where we care more about each other and the planet than we do about egoic folly. Part of your
Mm.
vision. And this speaks to the I that is actually resonating with love. There's a connection. And I'd be very interested in just kind of unbundling that a little bit with you, if we could, in the time that we've got left here.
Sure.
Where does love come into your work with your clients?
Mm. You know, I would start by saying that love to me exists in that plane of what we cannot often describe, but we all know is there, right? If you want to call it awareness, you could call it the soul. There's many ways that humanity throughout time has tried to describe what connects all of us, right?
Mhm.
I'm sitting with you now, and there's a field of awareness between you and I that, if we were to call it just I'm aware, you're aware, that we're both sitting in.
Mhm.
When we are listening and living from that place, love naturally occurs.
Yeah.
So I would say that the biggest demonstration of love that I give to my clients is by holding that space with them and for them so that they can hear what they often don't have time or haven't trained themselves to hear.
Mhm.
Oftentimes we're so contracted into our ego. And I want to just take a second to say what I mean by ego, because ego is very necessary, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's no one here that's about
Absolutely.
destroying the ego. There used to be a lot of, I don't know, confusing teachings and language around, like, we've got to destroy the ego, right? But the ego keeps us safe. It keeps us working. It keeps money in our pocket. And certainly, if you want to go live in a cave and have people taking care of you, you could destroy your ego. But more importantly, I think it's to bring the ego in so close that it's every move,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? The ways in which it's trying to help you and trick you and protect you, but its voice so close that you're not going to be trapped by what it tells you need to do. And I'm going to give you an example of this. And then I'm going to before we end, I want to talk about soul retrieval, which is when we kind of lose our way as an individual or as a company because we are listening to egoic folly. So what this would look like is, the ego wants to survive. The ego is not in a place where it's thinking about innovation or future or to skate where the puck is going, unless you're just trying to make money off of that, which again, I've seen time and time and again where that just falls down on itself again and again, right? So to me, that ego is going to tell us things like, um, um, if you don't work, you'll die,
Oh, yeah.
right? If you have to be quiet and not speak up or share your truth or be authentic because you will be seen too much and then you will be fired, right?
Yep.
So the ego's just trying to protect us. That's its job. Where people can lose their way so often is we become the ego, we become the routines, we become the stories, and we forget about who we once were and all of our dreams and what we wanted. And all of a sudden all of us have those moments. We've had those moments. I know you've had those moments without knowing you too well yet, Blaine. I know you've had those moments in your early past where you would wake up in your 20s and think, is this all there is? And then you you throw back a couple aspirin from the night before and you keep going to work, right? It's like, is this all there is? Wake up, go to work, try to blow off steam and then do it all again and then collapse on the weekend. And is this all there is? And then what do? We don't pay attention to those questions of is this all there is? We pay attention to the ego, which says, gotta do it.
Yep.
And so the loss of the soul comes when we've stopped listening to those sacred pauses. Mm-hmm. Those little ring-a-dings, ring-a-ding-a-ding-a-ding. I'm just telling you, pay attention to your life here because it's going by, right? Mm-hmm. And we kind of contract into this doing state. And I'm going to come back to love in a minute. I'm making a big circle here, but stay with me if you would. I'm appreciating it. And so when my clients come to me, oftentimes there's some issue, right? Like either there's a personality issue or personality conflict, or they're unhappy, or they want to do something different, or they're not advancing like they thought they were. And the first thing we need to do is sort of separate, well, where's the ego in this story? And let's honor her or him, right? But then also, can we come back to this larger space? Can we be together in that space? Can I hold presence for you so that you can begin to hear yourself again and hear what maybe you've forgotten? Yeah. That kind of ring-a-dings once in a while, but then you close the door and keep going. Can we just spend some time here? It's 1 hour of your life, maybe every couple of weeks, where you get to spend time in this place and re-examine the problem from a wide-angle lens. Mm-hmm. Right? That act of both people sharing that space is love. Where no one is trying to get to an answer. No one is trying to find the right collapse down thing. No one's trying to like focus that lens too quickly and put us back into a state of right, wrong, or doing or not doing. We're just holding wide open space. Imagine if the leaders in our world could do that.
Yeah, that reminds me of Rumi's poem, "Out beyond wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I will meet you there."
Meet you there. Yep. Yep. That's why I love doing these podcasts, right? Because it's like a half an hour where we just get to play in that space.
Yeah.
You know?
And speaking of a half an hour, drat.
Drat.
I would love to have you back on. We've actually got a couple of other shows. I mentioned David Meltzer. We do a couple of other different shows. I'd love to have you back on this one, but I'd also be very happy to have you come on one or more of our other shows. You are a
it would be my honor. Oh, that's likewise. It would be my absolute honor to play with you again in this wide open, wide angle lens.
Sold. Folks, we've been listening to Cari Jacobs-Crovetto. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I truly do. This has been a fascinating conversation. And if you're listening to this on a regular podcast channel, do yourself a favor and go to my YouTube channel where this is going to be up, because you will have the opportunity of having the visual of this. The interchange here, I think, is just absolutely delightful. I truly do. And visually, you'll be able to listen in a different way to just kind of bring that whole thing back to closure here. So, Cari, again, thank you so much. Where can people find out more about what you're up to? And is there anything in particular you'd like to highlight for people to pay attention to?
Yeah, so it's super easy to find me. I'm at carijacobs.com. And what I will highlight is I love working with all kinds of people. I am particularly hopeful that the kinds of people who will land on my step are people who really want to live a highly successful life where they can accelerate and have a good living and have a good life, but also know or have some inkling that there's more, right? And so they also want to live, let's call it a juicy, wonderful, sacred, fulfilling, heartfelt life. I work with a lot of women in enterprise. I work with a lot of creative people, and I work with a lot of startup CEOs. And if you go to my website, you can get an hour free with me.
Hey, I'm going to go sign up.
You got it. We'll just teach each other, Blaine.
There you go. That works fine. Folks, I'll see you on the next episode. Again, you've been listening to Cari Jacobs-Crovetto, Soul the Business with Blaine Bartlett. As always, my admonition at the end of this thing is to find ways to be a center of distribution in your life. Life works a whole lot better than if you're a center of accumulation. Nature works through distribution. It doesn't work through accumulation. Go forth and conquer. Take care. We're out of here.
That was so good, that last part.